Mirrorless cameras are now better than ever. We finally have cameras with high-end specs while being smaller and easier to use. But the key to getting a new camera is to find one specifically for your shooting style. Otherwise, you might get a camera you don't really like. So let's take a look at the best mirrorless cameras for different shooting styles and different type of users. And I'll also give you the best value cameras at the end of the video. And of course, I'll also leave links down below for the best pricing. Now, the number one thing that most people look for in a mirrorless camera is something that is small in size and travel friendly, while still having top-notch image quality and good specs. And it has to be good for both photos and videos. And that's where the A7C II comes in. The best thing about this camera is how small and compact it is. It literally fits in the palm of my hands. And I promise you, I have regular size hands. It's a great camera for all-day shooting handheld, and you can also put it on a gimbal very easily because of the small size. And the camera is also dust and waterproof, so you can go anywhere with it. And it also has a side articulating screen for seeing yourself and also high angle and low angle shots. And the screen is also touch sensitive, giving you full control over your camera's major settings like shutter speed, ISO, and aperture, and of course the menus and autofocus. And the autofocus in the A7C II is like every other Sony camera. It's absolutely 10 out of 10. No one does autofocus better, even though people keep telling me Nikon does it better or Lumix and Canon does it better. It's Sony, guys. The button layout is simple and easy, great for both beginners and advanced users, and it also has 3 custom modes on the mode dial for advanced users, so you can set this up for different shooting scenarios like portraits, low light, or slow motion. And it also has electronic viewfinder for photographers, but it's not the greatest viewfinder in the world. It's pretty bright, but the resolution really isn't there. It's good enough for composing, but it's definitely not a pro viewfinder. But again, it's not a pro camera. It does, however, have a large pro-style Sony battery that's going to give most people all-day battery life. It's going to give you several hundred photos and at least an hour and a half of non-stop video. And in my experience, the A7C II does not overheat, so you don't have to worry about that. And it also has one SD card, which is on the side of the camera for easy access, which should be fine for most people. However, I do know some advanced users may want a 2-card slot camera, which I will have later on in this list. And the image quality in the A7C II is absolutely breathtaking. There is literally no difference between the A7C II and a professional camera when it comes to image quality. And that's because it actually has the same 33 megapixel full frame sensor as the A7 IV. And 33 megapixels is a ridiculous amount of resolution that's going to give you a ton of detail for both photos and videos. The A7C II can shoot 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second that is downsampled from 7K, essentially giving you 7K quality and detail, but in a smaller and easier to edit 4K file. And it also has 4K at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion, but it does have a pretty heavy 1.6 times crop, which gives you a similar field of view to APS-C instead of full frame. Now, this is a pretty heavy crop, but it's pretty normal for a camera like this. But if you do want 4K 60 without a crop, there is something later in this list for you. And the A7C II also shoots photos at 10 frames per second, which is pretty fast for most action and sports, and it can also shoot up to 44 RAW photos or 1,000 JPEGs in a row, which is pretty ridiculous. This should be good enough for most people out there, but if this isn't quite hitting the spot for you, there's also the A7 IV, which is basically the pro version of the A7C II, which can shoot 1,000 RAW photos in a row if you're more of a pro photographer. But the best thing about the A7C II when it comes to image quality is that it also shoots 14-bit RAW photos and has S-Log3 and S-Cinetone for video. When it comes to color grading and actually editing your work, this is everything you need to deliver artistic masterpieces. The A7C II is pretty much the perfect camera for most photographers and video shooters. It's basically the A7 IV with better autofocus, and the only downside of the A7C II is the crop in 4K 60 and the fact that it only has a single card slot. And maybe you want something that's a little bit more pro and can also shoot faster than just 10 frames per second. In that case, this next camera is probably what you're looking for. One of my favorite cameras of all time is the Canon R6 Mark II and its budget little brother, the Canon R8. The main appeal of these cameras is that they have a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, and I do realize that's a lower resolution than the 33 megapixel sensor in the A7C II and the A7 IV, but this lower resolution actually gives these cameras some unique benefits. For one, both of these cameras have a triple base ISO of 800, 1600, and 3200, making them very versatile cameras for different shooting environments, including low light. The R6 Mark II can shoot up to 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode, but it can do 110 RAW photos in a row or 1,000 JPEGs. However, the budget little brother, the Canon R8, only shoots at 6.5 frames per second and only 57 raw photos in a row, but that's actually just about as good as the A7C II, and the R8 is also cheaper. But both cameras have a ridiculous electronic shutter mode that can shoot as fast as 40 frames per second, which is faster than real-time video, which is only 24 frames per second, and it can shoot 75 raw photos in a row. Both of these cameras are everything you need for great action and sports photography. However, because it's an electronic shutter, you will have a little bit of rolling shutter, but for most amateurs, you probably won't even notice. And also, thanks to the fact the R6 and R8 both have an amazing AI-based autofocusing system, which isn't quite as good as Sony, but it's pretty decent, both of these cameras are super reliable when it comes to autofocus, and you will not miss your photos. And the autofocus system also carries over to video. And in video, both cameras can shoot 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, with no crop or quality downgrade. And the video in all frame rates is actually downsampled from 6K, so you'll really get the quality of 6K video, but in a smaller 4K file. And both cameras can also shoot full HD at 120 frames per second and 180 frames per second, making them really good slow motion video cameras. And the R6 Mark II also has a 6-hour video record limit, and this camera does not overheat. So when it comes to video, this camera is an absolute monster. However, the budget little brother, the Canon R8, isn't really made to be a pro-style camera, and I probably wouldn't use it for that. And both cameras also have C-Log 3 for advanced color grading, and the Canon colors right out of camera are gorgeous, so you're going to have a really easy time color grading this video. Now, when it comes to design, the R6 Mark II is a beefy pro-style body that has pretty much everything the A7C II was missing. It has way more buttons and dials that let you change your settings and work faster. And it also has a side articulating screen that gives you the same touch functionality as the A7C II, including touch autofocus and touch controls over your major settings and menus. And the R6 Mark II also has one of the best electronic viewfinders I've ever used. It's crisp, it's bright, has a really fast refresh rate so there's no lag, and just overall, it's so much better than the A7C Mark II's viewfinder. And the R6 Mark II also has a large Pro style battery along with dual SD card slots, so if you wanted that, this is probably the camera for you. However, the R8 only has one SD card slot and has a really small battery. The R8 is basically a compact version of the R6 Mark II, but with fewer buttons to keep the size down, but it has most of the Pro specs. And the R8 is also $1,000 less than the R6 Mark II, which is why I'm talking about it. So whether you want a proper Pro style mirrorless camera or something small and casual, both the R6 Mark II and R8 are great choices. Now, this is the part of the video where I tell you about the absolute best mirrorless cameras in the world, but chances are you probably don't want to drop $5,000 on a new camera, so instead I want to tell you about the best value for your money cameras, or the best bang for your buck cameras for both photo and video. And the first of these cameras is the Sony a6700, the best bang for your buck video camera. The body and design of this camera are pretty much identical to the A7C II, making this a very small and travel-friendly camera, and it also has a mode dial with 3 custom profiles. Plus, it also has a side articulating screen that's also touch sensitive for touch autofocus and menus and major settings. And it also has a single card slot on the side with a Sony-style Pro battery. Inside the a6700, you have a 26 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is about 1.6 times smaller than the A7C II, R6, and R8. But a smaller sensor does not mean that it's worse in terms of image quality. And 26 megapixels is pretty much the same resolution as the R6 Mark II, so it's plenty of information for both photos and video. And the a6700 also has a dual native ISO of 800 and 2500, and in either of these ISOs you will get very clean results, so it's a pretty decent low light camera as well. In video mode, it shoots 4K at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, but it's not regular 4K, it's 4K that's downsampled from 6K, so just like the R6 Mark II, which is a lot more expensive, you get 6K detail but in a smaller 4K file. The a6700 also has 4K at 120 frames per second, which is something no other camera on this list can do. However, in this mode, the sensor once again crops by 1.6 times on an already cropped sensor, so it does give you a pretty tight or zoomed in image, but it's a nice feature to have. And the a6700 can also do Full HD at 120 frames per second without cropping. And of course, it also has S-Log 3 in 10-bit color and a high bitrate codec that's anywhere between 250 to 600 megabits per second, making this pretty much as good as the A7C Mark II in terms of video. And the a6700 actually is the same camera as the FX30, which is a pro camera, but in a more hybrid or more casual style body. So if you do want to use this for serious video work, there's very little stopping you. And the a6700 can also shoot at 10 frames per second, up to 59 raw photos in a row, and unlimited JPEGs, which is pretty close to what the A7C II can do, but for $1,000 less, making this also a great action camera for sports and wildlife and just any kind of fast-moving subject matter. With the a6700, you're getting all the benefits in terms of body and design from the A7C II, with very good shooting speeds and video frame rates, and it's pretty much going to give you everything you wanted from a camera like the A7C II, but for $1,000 less. And this is why the a6700 is the best bang for your buck, or the best value for your money camera in terms of video. However, if you're more of a photographer, the camera you should actually be looking at is the Canon R7. And it's also the same price as the Sony a6700. The R7 is basically going to give you all of the same features and benefits in terms of body and design as the Canon R6 Mark II, along with a side articulating screen with touch autofocus, dual SD card slots, and a large Pro style battery. But the body is slightly smaller and lighter, but it still has long record times and overheating should not be an issue. But what really sets the Canon R7 apart for photographers is the sensor. While it does have a smaller APS-C size sensor, instead of 26 megapixels like the a6700, it actually has a 32 megapixel sensor, which is pretty much the same resolution as the a7C II, which is also a much more expensive camera. And the Canon R7's 32 megapixel APS-C size sensor is actually one of the highest resolution APS-C size sensors on the planet. The only thing that's higher is the Fuji X-T5, which is a 40 megapixel sensor, so it's a pretty badass sensor. I know I said a lot, but I love this sensor. And the R7 shoots 12 frames per second mechanical shutter mode and 15 frames per second electronic shutter mode, with 42 raw photos in a row or 126 JPEGs. And surprisingly enough, the R7's low light performance is pretty decent as well. The R7 can also shoot 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second that is downsampled from 7K, essentially giving you 7K detail and clarity, but in a smaller 4K file. I feel like I've said this so many times, but just in case you forgot. And it also has 4K at 60 frames per second, but this mode is not downsampled. And it also does full HD at 120 frames per second. Plus it has C-Log 3 for color grading that's also 10-bit. So if you want something that's a little bit more affordable than a pro camera, but you still want a high resolution 32 megapixel sensor with a pro style body and dual SD card slots, the R7 is definitely the camera you should get as a photographer. But whichever camera you get, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.